Ecclesiastes chapter 4, beginning in verse 13. 2 weeks ago, as we concluded our study, we were talking about the materials in chapter 3 and 4, the summary statements of the laments that Solomon had, beginning in 3:17, that God will judge. 3:22, enjoy your work now. Number 3, his lament was that there was no solution for the oppressed. Number 4 was, it is better one handful with quietness than much with discord. 4:9, 2 are better than one. And the last of the 6 laments that are found in this section begins in chapter 4, verse 13. Let's read it and then make observations. Better a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who will be admonished no more. For he comes out of prison to be king, although he was born poor in his kingdom. I saw all the living who walk under the sun. They were there with the second youth who stands in his place. There was no end of all the people over whom he was made king, yet those who come afterward will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and grasping for the wind. Solomon, as a king, was very aware of the challenges of leadership, also of the vanity of the fact that no matter how powerful you are as a king, at some point in time you're going to be replaced. And as one ages, perhaps there settles into him or her a feeling or a sense of entitlement, that somehow that there's something special because of who you are or where you are. And Solomon notes that the change will occur in life. You'll be demoted. You may have the greatest job in the world. I don't know what that would be, but you may have it. But if you do, at some point in time, you'll lose it. It will either be outsourced, or you'll be moved, or you'll retire, or something else is going to go away. I was reading with some degree of fascination. I don't have the control over everything that pops up on my little home page on the computer, so I get some rather interesting and sometimes bizarre pieces of information. Sometimes I chase them and find interesting things. A week or so ago, one of the little news things popped up, and I don't remember how it was listed exactly, the 100 most beautiful women or something like that. Some group does a equally, let me rephrase that. I was about to be demeaning. Does one for men as well. But it described the top 100 women, and then the author of this went on to point out that Miss Jolie and some others who had been on the list before weren't there any longer, that they didn't even manage to break the top 10, and that most of the younger starlets were from new television shows and things of this sort. And I thought about, as time goes on, what would it be like to have at some point been described as the most beautiful woman in the world, or most desirable, or on the guy's side, the most handsome or the most eligible, or however that's graded. And then to watch yourself slide from that position down the list. Many of you probably watched and have watched as those who have been movie stars, especially known for their beauty, aged. And some do so more gracefully than others. I don't mean by that they look better. I mean that it is a challenge when one is noted for youth and beauty as you age, that youth and beauty does not stay young. You change with that. And that's a challenge. And some do well. I remember seeing years ago Kenny Rogers in an interview while he was at the top of his game. And people were talking about how, great of a singer he was and this sort of thing. And he said, well, you have to not take success and popularity too seriously, because I know at some point in time it's going to go away. At that time, he had a television show, and he had several hit songs on the radio, and lots of stuff was going on. He said, it just won't last. Who played in the World Series 2 years ago? Anybody know? How about the Super Bowl 3 years ago? Tell me who was the most valuable player in that game. Unless you are a real sports trivia guy or gal, chances are you don't know that information. Anybody in here know it right offhand? I'll give you a chance to shout out. A lot of people would, as one of the most popular games. But you can ask any high-profile person, whoever it is that gets fame and notoriety for some aspect of life, it's going to be fleeting. You're only going to be there for the briefest moment of time, and then you're going to be going somewhere else. And this was Solomon's lament. He's here. He says, I'm at the top of my game. I'm the king. I have riches. I have all of these things. I am so powerful. I am so blessed. Actually, I'm not sure he uses that word anywhere. But then he goes on to say, but some young upstart's going to become king after me. And it won't matter how popular a king I am. They're not going to remember me. And they're not going to remember how powerful I was and how many people I ruled over. And that bothered him. Vanity. It's all vanity. Striving after the wind and emptiness. I think it would be a challenge for those of our presidents who have begun to serve at a relatively young age to live on after that. And some have done, again, better than others at that. And I don't have any ill will toward former President Clinton. I'm not singling him out for any derision. A two-term president who was a very popular man at some points in his career, at other points not so much. But after he left office, he had some challenges. He went from being the most listened to and most powerful, and I use that term in quotation marks, most powerful man in the world, to being the former president of the United States. That's a hard transition to make. Now, both of the Bushes, in leaving their position of influence and power, and Jimmy Carter also, were family men. They had a lot of life. They had farms. They have history. And they went back to their homes and enjoyed life. Bill Clinton didn't have a family to go back to. He didn't have a business to go run. He didn't have a farm to live on. He didn't have, what do you do with your life after that point? How do you keep from wanting to get in front of a microphone and get your face back on the television and talk about the then president? And he did some of that. And some folks criticized him for, get out of the spotlight. It's not your turn anymore. Nobody was second-guessing you when you were president. They were too. It happened all along. But the now what has got to be something that he has faced and continues to struggle with. Here's Solomon expressing a similar thought. We may not find ourselves in that category, but even if you had it all, at some point you're going to lose most of it. Okay? Any thoughts you want to add to that before I move along? A lot of ego expressed by Solomon, as in Solomon has an ego that shows. Most of us, even if we have a bit of an ego, we get beaten down in life, and we're not in positions of high prominence. Because he held that as something valuable. I am not going to be remembered for the great man I am. Yeah. That's true. And are generally unknown because of it. That's right. It certainly is the case that he tips his hand to how disappointed he is going to be at the loss of certain things. His position, his notoriety, his power, his possessions. He is obviously distressed at that and speaks concerning them. And that's part of our learning process, is to see a great man who was apparently not humble.
Well, I guess what I'm saying, there's an irony there, that with the wisdom that Solomon possessed, that he was unable to deal with this in a more graceful way. He comes off as petulant and a poor old me in these scriptures.
As we began our class, we talked about the fact that a lot of the statements in the book of Ecclesiastes are raw, unedited emotion. Solomon is letting his ugly side show. He's not trying to paint a pretty picture of himself. He's passing along wisdom to others. He said, I had these feelings. I shared these concerns and difficulties. And hopefully from us discussing them, we learn how better to serve. And we see his weaknesses in his life. Anybody else? Okay, chapter 5, verse 1. Beginning in verse 1 and going through verse 7, we have a discussion about vows. Probably something that is not, again, a prominent thing in your life, but is a very interesting discussion nonetheless. Let's spend some time there. Let's read through the first 7 verses. There are a couple of verses that don't fall into the category quite as easily, but I'm not going to spend too much time trying to push those. Walk prudently when you go into the house of God, and draw near to hear rather than to give the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they do evil. Do not be rash with your mouth, and not let your heart utter anything hastily before God. For God is in heaven, and you are on earth. Therefore let your words be few. For a dream comes through much activity, and a fool's voice is known by his many words. When you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you have vowed. Better not to vow than to vow and not pay. Do not let your mouth cause your flesh to sin, nor say before the messenger of God that it was an error. Why should God be angry at your excuse and destroy the work of your hands? For in the multitude of dreams and many words there's also vanity, but fear God. Caution regarding vows. The word is translated walk in verse 1. New King James Version and the King James Version, shamar, means to guard. Actually, I think the King James Version says keep there, doesn't it? It means to protect or preserve. Solomon says when you go to the house of God, go to hear, not to be heard. That's an interesting observation, not to speak like foolish ones. And he gives an example of those who come and they speak foolishly. They say words, but their words are not appreciated as being words of wisdom. Instead, they are words that are going to cause them some trouble. Now, the concept of vowing and of offering sacrifices and what we should bring before God is one that we can have some interesting readings over. Let's spend a few moments running around a bit. Let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 22. Let's pick up the context, I suppose, in 21 just a little bit. But the people took of the plunder sheep, oxen, the best of the things, which should have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal. 1 Samuel 15:22 now. So Samuel said, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you've rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. The sacrifice that Saul brought to God under the presumption that this would be pleasing to God. Saul's excuse in not being obedient to the voice of God to destroy completely the people that God sent him out for was because he said, I want to go and offer these things to the Lord. Well, God didn't need the sacrifices of the Amalekites, and it wasn't even a sacrifice. If the children of Israel went out and captured the spoil of this people, then it really didn't come from them. It didn't come from their heart. It wasn't something that they brought. And so there would have had to have been a value in the animals themselves being sacrificed on the altar. And Samuel puts this into perspective. He said, listen, Saul, we are not honoring God because we're over here burning up animals. That's not where the sacrifice is. The sacrifice we bring to God is because it came from us, it cost us something, and because we have humbled our hearts to do so. What God wants from you is to be obedient. He wants you to follow the advice of God, not bring all these animals in here and slaughter them. Saul was foolish. Now, a little farther. Chapter 51 of the book of Psalms. Let's see. Verse 16. Psalm 51:16. For you do not desire sacrifice, or else I would give it. You do not delight in burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart. These, O God, you will not despise. Now, as David expresses this thought, he says, here is the real key to making a sacrifice to God. Not in what we bring, but in what we say, what our heart is, our motive is, our desire is. That is the real sacrifice to God. And when we bring humility, when we bring a heart that is humbled, that bows down before God, that's worship. Not the objects. A little farther, Ecclesiastes chapter 10. And we'll get to this in time. Verse 12. The words of a wise man's mouth are gracious, but the lips of a fool shall swallow him up. The words of his mouth begin with foolishness, and the end of his talk is raving madness. A fool also multiplies words. No man knows what is to be. Who can tell him what will be after him? The labor of a fool wearies them, for they do not even know how to go to the city. The statements made here about the words of a wise man contrasted with the words of a serpent, a babbler, the words of a fool, all of these things are tied back to the idea of when you come before God, be careful about what you say. The two statements here about the worried days, just like dream comes through much activity when you've had a busy day or a lot of dramatic things happen to you and a lot of activity, maybe frustrations and challenges. It does affect our dreams. Many of us will have troubled dreams because of the challenges of life. And Solomon only ties that together to say that in the same way that a busy day will often cause you to have a disturbed night, in the same way lots of words from a fool are going to cause him some trouble or get him in trouble. Let's talk about the vowing here. The vows and keeping them. When you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it. The word translated vow is from the Hebrew word neder, which means to make a promise. It is never required of people to make promises to God. In fact, we have quite the opposite. There are often cautions regarding doing it. Let's go back and read from Deuteronomy chapter 23. Deuteronomy 23:21. When you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay to pay it. Well, that sounds familiar. For the Lord your God will surely require it of you, and it would be sin to you. Now watch verse 22. But if you abstain from vowing, it shall not be sin to you. That which is gone from your lips you shall keep and perform, for you voluntarily vowed to the Lord your God what you have promised with your mouth. The instruction that Moses gave to the children of Israel as they came to the land of Canaan is you don't have to make a vow before God. There is no requirement whatsoever for you to make a promise. Never is there a need for you to promise God anything. But if you do make a promise to God, they're not just words. You have promised. And you better pay. There are interesting examples of some vows in the Old Testament. Probably one of the more familiar would be that of Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 1. 1 Samuel 1 verse 2, the man who's described had 2 wives. The name of one was Hannah. Whenever a time came for Elkanah to make an offering, he would give portions to Peninnah, his wife, and all her sons and daughters, but to Hannah he would give a double portion, verse 5, for he loved Hannah, although the Lord had closed her womb. And her rival also provoked her severely to make her miserable, because the Lord had closed her womb. So it was year by year when she went up to the house of the Lord that she provoked her, and therefore she wept and did not eat. And her husband said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? Why is your heart grieved? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? Hannah rose after she had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh. Eli the priest was sitting on the seat by the doorpost of the tabernacle of the Lord. She was in bitterness of soul and prayed to the Lord and wept in anguish. Verse 11, then she made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a male child, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall come upon his head. You remember that it does in fact come to pass that God grants Hannah a son. And that son is going to be, after he is taken up from being weaned and grown into a very young man, taken and given over to the service of the Lord in the temple. And that young man's name will be Samuel. And Samuel will become the greatest prophet and servant of the Old Testament, perhaps until the coming of Elijah. So Samuel is going to play a very, very prominent place in Scriptures. How did he come to be? He came to be because of his mother, who had no children. What were the names of Peninnah's children? What significance did they play in the story that is given here? Don't know who they are. They're nothing. They're nobody. But here's this woman who, because of her desire for a child, a boy child that she could dedicate to the Lord, made this vow to God. If you'll give me a child, I'll give him to you. The story is not given as a sample of what should be done, but it definitely is an example of following the instruction of the Scriptures from the text in Deuteronomy that we read a while ago, and also from the book of Psalms. You follow the vow that you've given. Would it have been difficult for Hannah to give up that little boy after God gave her the son? This was something that she longed for more than anything else. And when it was granted to her, what did she do with this boy? She gave him to God as a service. Did that represent a great gift to God from Hannah? Oh, yes, absolutely. What if she had reneged on her promise? What if she had not fulfilled her promise? How would we look at, and what would be the story at that point? I don't know. Let's go read another one, though. There are two or three I want to dig up here. Genesis chapter 28. Verse 20. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and keep me in this way that I am going, and give me bread to eat and clothing to put on, so that I come back to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone which I have set as a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will surely give you a tenth. Jacob makes an interesting vow. Now, Jacob is not the Bible's most wonderful personal character. He definitely is a man with some flaws. As a young man, he had some challenges. And don't judge Jacob too harshly. We don't really understand what level of information he had about God. He certainly didn't have the Old Testament to read from. He didn't have all of the knowledge about God that we do. He had a godly mother and father, but there were some challenges even there in that relationship. He knew who his grandfather was, Abraham, but there were, lots of issues that he had to struggle with. Now here, as a young man, he says, and he's making this vow to God. He said, you let me get home safe. Just let me get back home and take care of the things that I need. You give me food and clothing and get me back home safely, Lord, and I will never turn away from you as my God. And I will give a tenth of everything that ever comes into my possession. I will not fail to tithe to you. We have no reason to believe that Jacob failed in that promise. He made his vow to God. God saw him safely home, and Jacob is going to be the man who God changes his name to Israel. He is going to be the one through whom all the children of Israel, that word, that phrase, comes to be understood. He made this promise. One of the most controversial vows, without a doubt, comes from the book of Judges. Judges chapter 11. And let's touch quickly on this. I don't want to spend all day. But Judges 11. I'm just going to read a couple of verses. Verse 30. Jephthah made a vow to the Lord and said, if you will indeed deliver the people of Ammon into my hands, then it will be that whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the people of Ammon shall surely be the Lord's, and I will offer it up as a burnt offering. So Jephthah advanced toward the people of Ammon to fight against them, and the Lord delivered them into his hands. Verse 33, and he defeated them from Aroer as far as Minnith, 20 cities, and to Abel Keramim, with a very great slaughter. Thus the people of Ammon were subdued before the children of Israel. All right, Jephthah, the judge, has been raised up to defend God's people and to save them from the onslaught here of the Ammonites. He says, God, if you will allow me to have this victory, whatever comes out of my house, I'll dedicate to you. This is sometimes described as Jephthah's rash vow. And as he returns home, what comes out? Verse 34, Jephthah came to his house at Mizpah. There was his daughter coming out to meet him with timbrels and dancing. She was his only child. Beside her, he had neither son nor daughter. And it came to pass when he saw her that he tore his clothes and said, Alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low. You are among those who trouble me, for I have given my word to the Lord, and I cannot go back on it. For Jephthah's part, he understood that his statement before God was binding, and he intended to keep it. Would that have been in harmony with what Solomon is teaching in Ecclesiastes chapter 5? Yes. Did Jephthah vow rashly in what he did? Most of us would say, yes, he did. By leaving it generic like that, he left the opportunity for something terrible to happen that he did not intend. And I'm not going to this evening debate the entire discussion of did Jephthah actually commit his daughter as a burnt offering or not. She was definitely committed to the service of God. Whether she was put to death is up to debate amongst scholars. Let's read, though. I want to read you something. This is a blog or a religious discussion in print on the internet. And it has to do with this particular topic. And I appreciate the author's thoughts here, and I'm going to share them with you. He's had a discussion of some length about Jephthah and Jephthah's daughter and the vow and all of that to do. And then we come to this. I am not sure what to do with this text. How could it be that keeping a promise to God is more important than the life of our children? I guess I should make sure I don't make any absurd promises. I read this text and then think about all the empty promises that we make toward God. In fact, we find ways to constantly rationalize our breaking of promises around this abused theme of forgiveness. It's as if we got this thing backwards, that somehow if we are going to break any vows because God is the one that will understand, then it is best to break our vows to God. But it is precisely why our vows to God should be the first priority. It is in making God the first priority in life that all other life flows from. I can't help but wonder what would happen if a group of people felt this passionately about keeping a promise to God. I wonder what would happen in our marriages, our parenting, our churches, if we kept without rationalizing everything that we said we offered to God. I have to admit, this text has got me into a minefield of questions, and I'm really not sure which direction to go. But I am reminded that God's promises, I am reminded that promises to God are serious business. I want to read you one more. I ran across an article recently. I have already made about a dozen references, both in print and preparation, for this particular article. I'll go ahead and tell you where it is. It was in the February issue of the Reader's Digest, from which Lonnie and I have teased each other over the years of drawing our sermon material from. This particular article is entitled The Bottom Line on Happiness, and it is written by Clayton M. Christensen, who is a Harvard Business School graduate, maybe even a professor there. And it was printed first in the Harvard Business Review. Now, the article that follows is really interesting. And to think that this was written in the Harvard Business Review is challenging to me. I'd love to read you the whole thing. We can't do it. Let me read an excerpt. I'd like to share a story about how I came to understand the potential damage of just this once. I guess I need to give you a little more background. He has 5 main points in his little speech about the pursuit of happiness, and number 3 is avoid the just this once tendency. And the idea that, okay, I know it's wrong, I know this isn't the right move, but just this one time, I'm going to violate what I believe to be right. I'm going to violate my conscience. I'm going to do what I know is wrong. I'd like to share with you a story about how I came to understand the potential damage of just this once in my own life. I played on the Oxford University varsity basketball team. We worked hard and finished the season undefeated. It wasn't terrible language he used, just slang I'm not going to include. The guys on the team were the best friends I've ever had in my life. We got to the British equivalent of the NCAA tournament and made it to the Final Four. It turned out the championship game was scheduled for a Sunday. I had made a personal commitment to God at age 16 that I would never play ball on Sunday. So I went to my coach and explained my problem. He was incredulous. My teammates were too, because I was the starting center. Every one of the guys on the team came to me and said, "You've got to play. Can't you break the rule just this one time?" I'm a deeply religious man, so I went away and prayed about what I should do. All right, now you tell me how the rest of this story goes. What do you think is going to happen here? Is he going to play or not? How many think yes? How many think no? Well, there are far more yeses in this audience than there are no's. I'm a deeply religious man, so I went and prayed about what I should do. I got a very clear feeling that I should not, that I should not break my my commitment. So I didn't play in the championship game. In many ways, that was a small decision involving one of several thousand Sundays in my life. In theory, I could have crossed over the line just that one time and then never done it again. But looking back, I see that resisting the temptation of just this once was one of the most important decisions I have ever made. My life has been an unending stream of extenuating circumstances. Had I crossed the line that one time, I would have done it over and over in the years that followed. The lesson I learned is that it's easier to hold to your principles 100% of the time than it is to hold to them 98% of the time. If you give in just this once based on a marginal analysis, as some of my former classmates did, you'll regret where you end up. You've got to decide or define for yourself what you stand for and draw the line in a safe place. If a promise doesn't mean a promise, what does it mean? If a vow doesn't mean a vow, what does it mean? And I know when I was reading this, I'm going, he's going to play. He's going to play. Explain it. He didn't play. He didn't play? Really, he didn't play. And then all the consequences of that, struck up. Here's this guy, starting player on a championship team. They've come to the final games. They're all there. All of Britain is watching this, and the guy says, I ain't playing today. You're what? I'm not playing today. You have got to be kidding. How much pressure do you think was applied to this young man to force him to play? How do you think his coach reacted to this news? How do you think his players reacted to that news?
But the point is, Tim, that young man showed more character, more judgment at his age than a lot of us do at twice his age and more.
Amazing article. I highly recommend you read it. I'll be glad to give you a copy of it if you'd like. When you vow, make your vow and mean it. There was a verse I was going to read. It came to my mind a while ago, and I've forgotten what it was now. Give me 15 seconds. If I can't find it, we'll go on. Okay, verse 10. Let's keep going. Verse 8. All right, so Solomon, popularity is going to pass away. If you make a vow to God, keep your vow. Keep your vow. Verse 8 and 9. If you see the oppression of the poor and the violent perversion of justice and righteousness in a province, do not marvel at the matter, for high official watches over high official, and higher officials watch over them. Moreover, the profit of the land is for all, and even the king is served from the field. Solomon says the transition to this section begins with an interesting and kind of an obscure statement. Who does the oppression of life? Who oppresses others? Do powerful people or weak people oppress? It's the powerful who oppress, and the weak are oppressed. But Solomon says, don't be surprised at this. That's what happens in life. Powerful people oppress others, but they themselves also have to answer to other. There's always someone more powerful than they are, and you keep looking over your shoulder, you're going to come eventually to the time where you have to answer to God. And you better watch out about that. Even from top to bottom, we all come from the same place. Even the king is going to be served by the field. One of the comments that Paul makes to, and Peter too, to those who have slaves in the New Testament is, masters, take care of your slaves, remembering that you also will answer to God as his servant. And how you treat your servant will matter. Thank you for your time and attention. Next week, Lord willing, I want to pick up there in verse 10. Beginning in verse 10 and going through the end of, or at least 80% of the chapter of 6, deals with Solomon and money, wealth. It's a wonderful study. Hope you'll be with us next week as we continue.